Hey folks, today I just wanted to keep things simple and talk to you about a video in which Dave Rubin lies about George Carlin. And immediately, I can anticipate your objections, right? How can Dave Rubin lie about this? You have to have a modicum of intelligence to lie about things, and alright, you've got me there. But nonetheless, he does say some untrue things about George Carlin and misleads his audience in a very interesting way. Now, immediately much like anyone else who spent too much of their life listening to George Carlin, gets, I think, a bit defensive when conservatives try to claim him as one of their own, because he just emphatically wasn't. But alright, let's let Dave talk, because legally I'm required to do that.
My friend Russell Brand had a nice little, diatribe, a little diddly, let's say.
I'm sorry, a little... what? Is that a slang term that I'm not familiar with?
You don't need grand conspiracies to pull things off.
The truth is often concealed and manipulated when various interests appear to conspire to manage information in ways that seem advantageous to the interests of the powerful. Remember, you have to be careful about using the word conspiracy because, as George Carlin always said, where interests converge, no conspiracy is necessary.
These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them.
Now, immediately, I hope that this is setting off a couple of alarm bells for you, right? Oh, fantastic. These people are going to use something that George Carlin said to justify their random nonsense conspiracy theories. And that's definitely what they're doing. But I do think that they're keeping it intentionally vague, if for no other reason than because George Carlin never said anything that these people would actually agree with if they listened to it in its full context.
And we should play more George Carlin stuff. So yes, you don't need a grand conspiracy. When you look around at the world right now and you go, how is all of this crazy stuff possible? How is it that we now make it so that if you're not racist, you're actually racist? And how is it that if you have a penis, we call you a girl, and a whole bunch of other stuff? And it's like, well, there has been not a grand conspiracy per se.
And immediately we've lost the plot. See, the main issue that I have with this video, besides its contents, which are asinine at best, is that it's titled specifically using George Carlin's name to attract some amount of legitimacy to this ridiculous position. But the problem is, Dave Rubin has no fucking clue what George Carlin said or what he meant by any of the things that he said. And already I feel a little bit uncomfortable speculating about what a dead person would think now, or really even speculating just on the specific intricacies of their ideology at the time. So I'm gonna keep it to a minimum here, but obviously that's what Dave Rubin's trying to do, so I don't feel too bad about countering it a little bit. With the immediate, most obvious criticism that you could possibly have being that if you've listened to any amount of George Carlin, you know that at the center of his comedy, at the center of his political commentary, is a deep distrust for and disdain for authority. People trying to control your life in any sort of way. The sorts of people, for instance, who might try to police your sexuality or your gender identity or your participation in anti-racist movements. It really seems like a lot of conservatives only remember George Carlin for saying stuff about conspiracies and making fun of feminists. And with that in mind, it's so bizarre to go back and actually listen to the things that he said on those topics, because it becomes abundantly clear that whatever the conservative perspective on this is so far from what he was trying to communicate that it becomes embarrassing. For instance, in a 1990 album, among several things that I disagree with and some that I don't, he criticized white feminists for not caring about Latino women and black women's issues.
You don't hear much about that from these middle-class women. I've noticed that most of these feminists are white middle-class women. They don't give a shit about black women's problems. They don't care about Latino women.
He also expressed explicit support for altering our language to an extent to better communicate egalitarian ideas, something that Dave Rubin is disgusted by.
But when it comes to changing the language, I think they make some good points, because we do think in language. And so the quality of our thoughts and ideas can only be as good as the quality of our language. So maybe some of this patriarchal shit ought to go away. I think spokesman ought to be spokesperson. But they take it too far. They take themselves too seriously. They want me to call that thing in the street a personhole cover.
But perhaps more relevant are some of the comments that he had after Hurricane Katrina. And if you're a fan of George Carlin or you've been on Twitter in the last year, there's a good chance that you've already seen these before.
It shouldn't be a surprise that rich white men don't care about poor black people, period. The owners of this country don't care about the poor in general.
The owners of this country, what are we going... is this Karl Marx talking to me? The owners of this country are the voters of this country.
You're wrong about that, my friend. The real looting in this country takes place in the transfer of the wealth from the poor to the rich. I'm sorry that you don't like class and the truth, my friend.
See, the problem is that Dave Rubin is a staunch anti-woke capitalist, whereas George Carlin is none of those things. He has absolutely been critical of ideas expressed by those sorts of people, and definitely of their motives. But he didn't actually agree ideologically with anything that Dave Rubin has rattling around in that thing that charitably I have to call a brain. Dave Rubin, for all of his professed love of free speech, would be disgusted by the comments that George Carlin expressed about capitalism, about money, about class. If a blue-haired feminist said half the things that Carlin said, he would have dismissed them out of hand as crazy lunatics. Which, to me, kind of raises the question, why put up this charade at all? What's the point of pretending that George Carlin was on your side? What's the point of claiming the words of a dead person? And immediately you might jump to the exact same thing that conservatives do with Martin Luther King, where they'll make up opinions that he didn't actually hold and then claim him as a posthumous member of their political movement. And they do that, of course, because Martin Luther King is incredibly well loved by the American public today. And I mean, it's kind of hard not to. And so outright hating his ideas, outright despising everything that he stood for is not really politically viable. So they have to pretend like he agreed with them. But I don't think that's entirely what's happening with George Carlin, although that's definitely a part of it. See, the real problem is that regardless of whether you agree with him on a variety of issues, George Carlin's fucking funny. There are several rants and tirades that he went on that I find quite pernicious in the ideas that they're expressing, things that I disagree with vehemently, that I would be, I suppose you could say, offended by. But they're still goddamn hilarious. And that's really dangerous to people who are incapable of analyzing media. Someone who explicitly disagrees with everything that you stand for, but nonetheless is talented enough that even if you hate everything they're saying, is still hilarious, is still creative, is still funny, whatever the thing that they're trying to be. And so even if public perception of George Carlin was more negative than it is today, I think that you would still see some amount of claiming him as a conservative advocate, because listening to him, you want him to agree with you, even if he doesn't. It's one of those reasons why I find a lot of the claims that liberals and progressives today are just too offended by Dave Chappelle's comedy kind of laughable, because if you listen to most modern Dave Chappelle bits, they're just not funny. Like, I disagree with the ideas, I find them ridiculous and I suppose offensive, but more importantly than that, at least to broader society, is that they're just not well constructed. They're just not funny. But yeah, I don't think that you should venerate the words of Saint George Carlin or anything to that effect. I think that he was a deeply flawed commentator when it came to politics and sociology and whatever, even if overall I think that the ideology underpinning a lot of his ideas was really, really good. But that's kind of all conservatives have, is idols, is hero worship. And so they kind of have to do that. So I agree with Dave Rubin that they should be playing more George Carlin. I just don't think that I agree with him in the way that he wants me to. Anyhow, instead of subscribing to Dave Rubin, you should subscribe to me, and you should like this video, and you should share it with your grandparents.